It's too late for Annie Crook, separated from her child, driven to despair and death. You create allegiance above your sworn allegiance to protect humanity. You will not feel for them or acknowledge their pain. There lies the madness. I'm Chris Spivey.
And I'm Eddie Webb.
And today we're here to talk about Murder by Decree, the greatest Sherlock Holmes movie to ever be created to date. I was asking Eddie before we started, why did he choose this movie? Because it's such like an uplifting tale that gets me ready in the morning at like 4 over here to kick off my day.
I did not choose this movie. You, Chris Spivey, have created this hell. It's not that bad, actually. It's a nice segue into the 70s with Sherlock Holmes stuff because, to be honest, there weren't very many options. It was like either this or I think 7% Solution is the only real 70s movie that's kind of around this time period. So like this is definitely kind of a fallow period for films of Sherlock Holmes. But from a book perspective, the 70s is wild because it's a very much a radical reinvention of Holmes is happening around this time period. So Murder by Decree is a good illustration of that sea change, I think.
Now, joking aside, for me, I enjoyed this movie. It is not a happy movie. It's not a movie I would run and watch to, but I also watched it with my grandmother when I was growing up. This would have been her Sherlock.
Right. Yeah. And you put your finger on it, right? Like this is not the let's solve fun mysteries Sherlock that we've had bits and pieces of before. We saw a little bit in the 60s of a slight darkening of the character, but that was more of we're taking back to the original canon, the original stories. And those
I'm surprised that so I don't remember who actually chose this movie. Joking aside, as I like, it's hard to put the joking aside because it's fun to watch Eddie's face get all Eddie. But there was a almost different version of this movie from the 60s, A Study in Terror, actually, that was a British movie.
Yep.
So I was kind of surprised that you didn't choose that one over the Peter Cushing bit from the 70s. Is that because we wouldn't have potentially had a show for the 70s other than 7% Solution that I'm not a fan of?
Mm-hmm.
Although we could have done the Christopher Plummer Silver Blaze, I think was a Canadian movie.
Yeah, 77. So I mean, what I've been trying to do is that because this is a look through the times of Sherlock Holmes, one thing I wanted to avoid is us watching more or less the same movie back to back, or even in this run, right? I don't want us to be. I've seen this story before, because then it's okay. I'm only looking for the differences. I'm not taking that story in its full merits. So I tried to avoid stuff that was a little close, and also just frankly tried to avoid stuff that I wasn't as familiar with. The Peter Cushing was a bit of a shot in the dark, and as we talked about, I regret it. I thought it was going to go a certain way. It did not. So, they're not all winners. But also, like I said, the 70s, I mean, there were some more faithful adaptations in the 70s, like you mentioned. But this really is the time where people are starting to look at Sherlock Holmes and go, maybe the pieces don't need to, maybe we can take the pieces of the original character and put them together in different configurations. So this is, a couple things happen primarily in the 70s. The first, both of which we kind of intersect here. The first is reframing Sherlock Holmes with not necessarily new information, but better understanding of the context of the original information. And you get stuff like 7% Solution, which, spoiler for a 50-year-old movie, but Moriarty isn't real. Moriarty is a cocaine-induced hallucination. That's the big premise of 7% Solution.
Which is not I will say, out of most of the Holmes movies I've seen, I have not seen the one with Will Ferrell, but The Seven Step Revolution is my least favorite Holmes.
I the novel is pretty good. Um,
Haven't read it.
is written by Nicholas Meyer, who most people know as one of the executive producers behind the Star Trek movies. Weirdly enough, um, but he wrote a few novels, and basically from the conceit of if you approach the original canon a very specific way, you know, if you look at all the material here, you can come to new conclusions that don't necessarily map with our preconceived notions. So that's part of what 7% solution is supposed to be. Is like
Yeah.
there's no actual evidence of Moriarty existing. It's only Holmes telling Watson about Moriarty. Watson never actually encounters Moriarty. No other character encounters Moriarty. So that's kind of the conceit. It's like, so we can draw different conclusions. Um, and so that's one thing we kind of see in Murder by Decree is, um, you know, Holmes approaching the society for his time from a different perspective, from elements of Victorian society that weren't normally addressed in stories, but were existent in history. The other big movement in the 70s is the mashup, what we now call a mashup. This was the rise of Holmes versus Dracula, Holmes versus Jack the Ripper, which is relevant to Murder by Decree. Holmes versus other literary characters that had fallen in the public domain.
I'm gonna
Uh,
push back a little bit. The mashup is well loved before this point in time. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gotten seminal classics like Billy the Kid versus Dracula, my friend.
I'm not saying that the mashup started in the 70s. I'm saying Sherlock Holmes mashup specifically became popular culturally.
I know, but I just wanted to reference Billy the Kid versus Dracula. That was the easiest way to do
Right,
it.
yeah, but I'm gonna take your question seriously because that's the best way to diffuse your bullshit and reiterate
Oh,
that.
is we can play that now? Oh, all right. Let
Yeah,
me
I have more bullshit to give you.
let
What are you
me
talking about, sir?
let me readjust my glasses now and up my bullshit meter. It was
There's
at
no
a
upper limit.
4, but now it's going to 11.
But like technically speaking, there have been like I mentioned before, the Lupin, quote unquote, guest star of Sherlock Holmes, technically counts as a mashup, right? So I mean, certainly yes, they have existed before, and even in the Sherlock Holmes stories, there are references to other literary characters. He is dismissive of other literary detectives at the time. So I mean, that is kind of baked in, but we see a lot more of it happening around the 70s. Um, Silverberg does a number of these. I think he did one with um, Dracula. I think he did one with Dorian Gray. I think he did one where he meets. I think it's the Invisible Man. I'm not sure. I know there's one by a different set of authors who did Sherlock Holmes' War of the Worlds, which is deeply weird. He gets
How
married.
would
It's weird.
I'm trying to think of how that would work. All right.
Badly.
Huh.
Basically.
Because Dorian Gray is an easy one to make correlations to. That's like simple. But
Right.
War of the
Weirdly, in the
Worlds.
Dorian Gray one, he also meets the writer of Dorian Gray inside the story, so it's a little weird. Also, Isaac Asimov, I think, it did late 70s, early 80s, commissions a anthology of sci-fi Holmesian stories.
Hmm.
So the idea of Sherlock Holmes being more than just we could do slightly different Victorian mysteries uh, is very much in the zeitgeist of the 70s. So Murder by Decree is a good example of that kind of slightly darker, slightly more malleable Holmes culturally. So I mean, you did pick it because you mentioned that you really loved it. And then when you suggested it, I was like, that's actually a good one to illustrate this moment in time.
Okay. Because we have a big, massive sheet that goes around, and we send ideas back and forth all day, every day.
Right.
Some of them are mine, some of them are Eddie's. Most of them are mine because Eddie is constantly working, and I'm constantly just thinking about the podcast and
Right.
of I want to
What
watch.
about this? What about this? What about this? Okay. I
And
get.
so Sherlock was more of Eddie's thing because this is something you love, like
Mhm.
this character, this genre that we're going into, and it's something I enjoy. So I have a passing knowledge of it. It's also one of the reasons why people are following me on social media. I started rereading Sherlock Holmes stories just so I could up my game a little bit for these conversations.
Nice, nice. This reminds me also, this is another part where we start to see more adjacent Holmesian stories. Again, more in the books, but like I think the first Mycroft Holmes novels come up around this time. There is a Lestrade novel series, only a few books long, but that comes out around this time too.
Okay.
So the idea of again, like that, there's a wider palette you can do. Um, this is it's an interesting time culturally, um, but it's also not a boom. The '80s will be the next big boom of Sherlock Holmes. We will be spoiled for choice of what's cool media to do. Um,
We're right on the
but
cusp of it, though.
yeah,
In
we're not
'79.
quite there yet.
Did you ever see Christopher Plummer's Silver Blaze, where he played Sherlock?
I don't think so.
Okay. I haven't seen it either. I just know it exists. I was curious if you'd had a chance to see it.
No, I've
And
seen Murder by Decree a couple times.
what about a study in terror, the one from the '60s that this is not based off of, supposedly? They're very similar from what I've read. Because I haven't seen Study in
Um,
Terror either, but it's on my list.
no, because and this is going to be where I start to show my preferences. I generally don't like Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper stories, um, because it seems like a natural pairing. But to make it work, you either have to change Holmes or change the Jack the Ripper mystery to be
Mm-hmm.
solvable. Uh, um, for example, I'm a big fan of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, which is for those who don't know, it's a board game. Board game in the loosest sense. It's a game where basically you have a bunch of each case is a book, and you have to go around the map of London, find the locations, and there you get clues you put together to try to solve the mystery. It's actually quite fun. We played it over the pandemic quite a lot. But there is a Jack the Ripper box set. Well, a box that has Jack the Ripper cases in it, and it's easily the worst set of cases because they're trying to make the real world stuff fit into a Holmesian case, and it just doesn't work.
Hmm.
So I generally tend to avoid them because I am I've never been a huge fan of the Sherlock of the Jack the Ripper case, but having now lived in London for a while, I've moved to deeply suspicious of anyone who is super interested in Jack the Ripper, because now there is a whole category of people calling themselves Ripperologists.
Mm.
They made this their identity is this fucking case, and I'm like, one, not fucking cool to model your entire life after a serial killer, and two, it is kind of the diet soda of historian in that it looks a bit like history, but when you actually ingest it, you realize, oh no, this is just bullshit.
It's more conspiracy than history.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
could be
it really is.
historical conspiracy, technically. Yeah, that's yeah. Nah.
Right.
Are you in general a fan though of the Sherlock mashups? Because
Oh, yeah.
I remember you're talking about Sherlock and the Mythos. Not really, I think your jam. Sherlock and
Well,
Ripper,
okay.
not really your jam.
The Sherlock. Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's something we didn't do on the podcast. I did it in the Discord, but it's good kind of talking here. Is that I have been generally down on Sherlock Holmes versus Cthulhu just because, again, it's a case of either the Cthulhu mythos has to bend to suit Sherlock or Sherlock has to bend to suit the mythos. But uh, there have been a number of short stories, which is, I think, a better form for this kind of exploration where
Mm,
there's not around long enough to do damage to either.
yeah.
Um, and there was a great anthology, which unfortunately the name escapes me of because there are so many anthologies. But that's the one where Neil Gaiman's A Study in Emerald was originally published, which is a fantastic Holmes Cthulhu myth mashup that I can't really talk about because it spoils the entire thing. But
It's also a board
um,
game
it is also a board game
now.
and a comic book, actually. Uh, but there's also one like where Watson finds a strange Cthulhu artifact in Afghanistan, um, and stuff like that, where okay, that kind of stuff makes sense. And there was a video game that's Frogware's put out that I really like called Sherlock Holmes: The Awakened that does a really good job of this. So I mean, it's possible certainly. I think I mentioned before Hound of the D'Urbervilles, which is kind of a mashup, but it's from Moriarty's perspective. I have a couple of the Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula ones because I think that's a more natural pairing. Because Dracula does not want to be found and Sherlock Holmes wants to find him. So I mean, I think there's a natural kind of dynamic there, and also
What about the supernatural elements associated with Dracula?
Well, it's interesting because like there are two different takes for those, right? There's like there's 3 or 4 of them, which I think is enough to qualify as a very tiny micro genre of itself. And generally, it seems to fall down to: is this one where Dracula is supernatural, and if so, how much? Or is Dracula able to be explained? There is one that's not Sherlock Holmes necessarily, but it is a manga called DCRL, where Dracula is actually just a sentient plant. And that's why he has Earth shipped over, is because it's actually a plant that when enough of the Earth gets together, it could form into a humanoid walking plant creature. But there's one where Dracula's just a super insane fucking Romanian count who believes he's a vampire. But there's one where like, no, Dracula's straight up what he is, and Sherlock Holmes has to adapt to that. So I mean, these kinds of mashups can be really fun, and I'm generally a fan of most of them, or at least I'll try most of them. It's weirdly, because Jack the Ripper is not supernatural. That's the one that I think bugs me the most, because it's just not. I think part of my problem is either you have to reduce the impact on the women that were the victims in order to make it a good story, or you just have to accept a terrible person did some horrible things to women, which doesn't make it a fun mystery.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the conflict here. And to Murder by Decree's credit, it does an okay job of trying to strike that balance.
Yes. For a 70s movie, it does an exceptional job.
Yeah. I mean, like, of these mashups, this is the one I like the most. But it does mean if you're not prepared for a super dark Sherlock Holmes movie, it's going to be a bit of a mindfuck.
As you mentioned the movie, we can start shifting towards it. Over the interesting thing, I want to come back to that mashup sometime, probably before we're done the Sherlock Holmes run. Did you know that Christopher Plummer and James Mason were not the original choices for Holmes and Watson?
Really? No. Who was?
I heard that it was supposed to have been Peter O'Toole and I think it was Laurence Olivier, but they had beef and they could not put that aside. I would need to double check the Olivier part, but I knew it was like so it was Peter O'Toole as Holmes.
Which Olivier is Watson?
That's what I remember.
That would be weird. And cool, but it'd be weird.
As a huge Peter O'Toole fan, I would have loved to have seen Peter O'Toole play off Holmes in the 70s when he was still sort of in the height of his power. Not so much when he was in another movie that I love called like My Favorite. I think it was My Favorite Year with Peter O'Toole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which would have been fun to watch.
Yeah, there's a bit of our run coming up where it's someone who's not the height of their powers. And it's we're going to watch it. We're going to talk about it. But it's certainly, I feel that kind of, oh man, if you only done this a couple decades earlier.
Yeah. Any other things you want to talk about for the backstage for Murder by Decree before we jump into it?
I will say, like I mentioned before, actually it was on the Patreon feed. So if you're not on the Patreon feed, you won't get this context, and you should give Chris money to find out what I'm talking about. But I mentioned before that it's like I really love the kind of early 60s cinematography vibe, the aesthetics and look of it. And I feel pretty much the exact opposite, but late 70s, like the sound is always muddy. It's like cinematography finally discovered whispering and brown all at the same time. That's the same reason why I don't like the original Star. Well, there's lots of reasons I don't like the original Star Trek movie, but one of them is that everyone's just like huge score. And this movie is a fair bit of that.
Are you saying that you don't appreciate the greatness of 70s drama? What about Raging Bull or other cinematic masterpieces that look like
Raging Bull or any other 70s movie.
that feel like they're sleazy from top to bottom just because of the decade they were shot in? And I specifically say the word sleazy because that's what it
Well,
feels like when you watch it.
that's what's weird, right? Is like I'm talking about like the big budget movies all feel like this. When you get to the lower budget 70s films, I generally enjoy watching them more. Like the again, that kind of scummy, sleazy effect, but also like the audio is usually more natural at that point in time because they don't have the budget to do all the audio regulation. And so it's a little more kind of naturalistic. And I find that much more watchable than something like this, which is supposed to be this big, huge, elaborate, lavish production. It's just kind of very kind of quiet and subdued, which I get. I get like the technology had evolved for making movies to the point where they could do these kinds of things, but they just really fell in love with it for a number of years. And then the 80s swing around. Like, actually, no, people want to see like cool things on screen, so let's really focus on that.
Before we go into the summary, I do want to point out Christopher Plummer said that he wanted to make Holmes more human in his portrayal here.
Okay.
That was one of the underscoring things that he wanted to do. How do you like that?
I like it in a way. I'm by accident. I think this is a good contrast to the '60s Holmes because that was very much an actor trying to portray an accurate, authentic literary Holmes, and here we have Plummer who's doing much more. What if Holmes is a real person? And you can see the pretty strong contrasts in their portrayals when you look at these more or less back to back, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is not Holmes as the mysterious gentleman eccentric. This is Holmes as a man who's very frustrated. People can't see what he's seeing. And again, I think I can't say for certain, but I feel like Murder by Decree is a pretty strong step towards a more humanistic Holmes that we see, frankly, going forward. We don't see as much of this is the last vestige of the, let's call Rathbonian Holmes, right?
Mm-hmm.
That 60s was kind of the last gasp of that. And moving forward, we have what if we treated Holmes like an actual human with interiority? So that's definitely what we see here. The downside is that Watson gets pretty heavily marginalized as a result because Watson, in the original structure, is the person who provides the interiority for us because he's the narrator. So his thoughts and ideas and suggestions and his human emotions are what we glom onto, and Holmes is by design this weird outside force that doesn't poke into that. Now that we have the shift to let's make Holmes more of a real character, I like the portrayal, but it does mean that Watson's kind of superfluous to requirements. There'll be an answer to this in about a decade, but right now they haven't found that answer yet.
Yeah, and I could see that. One of the things for Mason is that he wanted to portray the role more serious and not, to quote Mason, buffoonish as Nigel Bruce did. He went out of his
Yeah,
way to highlight Watson's skill and seriousness.
yeah,
Hits their P scene that is humorous as it gets between the two of them.
right. There's a little bit of humor there, and frankly, it jars. Um, uh, I get why that the little bit of humor there, and normally I'm not against a little bit of humor in a serious film, but in this particularly dire film in that regard, like just for atmosphere purposes, it does jar a bit. But certainly I can see he's trying to do the best with what he has, right? It's just frankly, again, the script is not serving Watson well, so he only has so much to work with. But he does seem to be doing a really good job with what he has.
Okay. Because I was going to ask what your thoughts were, because we've discussed the evolution of Watson so far.
Yeah.
And I know that Holmes's evolution is one of the primary points for the thing, but I've had more fun understanding how you've adapted to Watson through each incarnation of each thing that we've watched.
I have opinions about Watson. That is true. I even wrote a book because arguing Watson's not an idiot. So Um, but yeah, honestly, it's the hardest because like really the 60s too, but 60s to 70s, um, uh, uh, the 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 cultural understanding seems to be, well, we're really here to see Sherlock Holmes. We don't really need Watson. Uh, my personal theory is I think it takes the buddy cop formula for people
Hmm.
to realize that Watson and Holmes do work as a duo, even though Watson and Holmes pioneered that format by reinvigorating it in a new structure. Then people could then reverse engineer that back onto Holmes and Watson.
Absolutely. Any other
But that's
comments
my
before I
take on
jump
it.
into the summary?
Nope. Let's talk about this movie.
We open on a matted painting of Mariel, England, with creepy music playing. Then we're on the cobblestone streets and back alleyways. Quickly then shifting, we have a slow moving horse and a masked carriage driver delivering an unseen passenger onto the scene before we jump over to the Royal Opera House. Holmes comments on the delay of the opening of the opera because of Prince of Wales. We get Watson making a dig at Holmes and Lestrade all at once, instantly establishing their friendship. The crowd is mixed between about the prince's arrival, some booing and others cheering. There's a clear class divide going on, and Watson saves the day through his sheer upper lippedness. And I'm pausing there.
Upper Oedipus. Um,
How many times would I ever get to put that in something I
no,
write?
almost never. Right? Yeah, you gotta go for it. Yeah, and like this is, I mean, the fact is that this is the first time, well, not the first time, but one of the first times where Sherlock Holmes has ever really addressed with, oh, by the way, he's technically middle class, right? In an
Mm-hmm.
era where middle class was just kind of forming. He's not quite upper class. He is not quite lower class. And so having a scene up front where it's like, by the way, in case you didn't know going to this movie, this is going to be a movie about class. Buckle in. Um, it does have the awkward moments of how Watson reacts. And Watson reacts correctly for his character, which is he is ultimately a royalist. He's a patriot, and so
Yeah.
he's going to support the monarchy. Um,
He fought in the armory, and they established Watson as like a loyal to England person. So if
right,
they say do X or Y, Watson's going to do X or Y.
right,
It's his association with Holmes that starts to change Watson.
right. And so his reaction is a is perfectly correct for the character, but because of how this is set up, it initially is a bit awkward because it's like, okay, cool, so Watson ultimately supports the upper classes, but the way Holmes reframes it is good, is that you did this to keep the peace, and Watson agrees with that assessment, which doesn't entirely take Watson off the hook for his classist tendencies, but certainly does make them more complicated, which helps as we go forward in the movie.
And you mentioned originally one of the things about Holmes is that he was sort of an alien in society. And
Yeah.
given his status and class, this, I believe, carries on that same alienness. Like he has a clearer picture of the class divides and is pushing for a very certain agenda that kind of goes against, I'm going to say, generally the norm for this society that he interacts and engages with, which keeps that alien nature but still lets him be human.
Right. And since this, one of the reasons why I like this adaptation more than others is because it's actually dealing with some aspects of the Jack the Ripper murder that most people kind of ignore, which is the fact that class plays a very strong part of how this all played out. And so it's one of the few times where Holmes makes perfect sense as a character to adapt into the Jack the Ripper mystery because you're right. He's uh, uh, well off enough that he doesn't need money, but is not so well off that asking for money is gauche.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, he does not fit into either extreme, which allows him to pass judgment on both, and he frequently does in media that he's in. So this again not unusual for him. So allowing him to navigate the class divides that are increasingly going to become a part of the movie, it makes sense for Holmes to do. Again, the downside is that Watson can't navigate this, so he's going to become increasingly superfluous to the plot as Holmes has to start moving between these two areas, and Watson simply can't make the same move.
And I think that is kind of brilliant, though, because it establishes his character and Holmes's character, and the fact that Watson is skilled. They give us scenes of Watson doing some skilled stuff,
Hmm.
and I love that dynamic. It's one of the things that first jumped out at me about the movie when I first saw it, even as a kid. Anything else before we move on?
Uh, Not much. I mean, just the fact that uh, I little things like I appreciated how all of the upper class characters were in the ground seats and all the lower class people were in the higher seats because
Yeah.
that's very much how their seating was arranged. So it helped me when I was watching this again and say, okay, no, I thought they had paid really close attention to Victorian detail, but it reminded me, yes, these are people who actually did some proper historical research when making this film to make sure every piece of this, obviously it's fictionalized, but they made a strong effort to make it feel as authentic as possible, which is very much appreciated.
Back on the dark London streets, we're given a hunter's view as the camera stalks its prey. The man spies a woman and strangles her to death outside of her home on the doorstep. Suddenly, back with Holmes and Watson leaving the opera. The newspaper men deliver papers about the murder in Whitechapel. In the cab to Baker Street, the duo discuss the murder of two other women, and Holmes laments no one has hired him to investigate the case, and he's concerned by that. Back at Baker Street, a trio of merchants stalk them and come into Baker Street and request the detective's aid. Holmes reluctantly takes up the case. As the killer strikes yet again, we get more Watson and Holmes humor that evening. The next morning, slightly later, the game is afoot. Holmes and Watson arrive at a police scene. They meet Lestrade and Detective Foxborough. Lestrade tells him that people believe the killer is in league with the devil. The grisly murder matches the others as Holmes finds clues at the scene. Sir Charles, the new head of the Scotland Yard, arrives and orders Holmes to leave immediately upon seeing him. He does this with a clue that he found while the police discover a message scrawled on a wall. Sir Charles reads it and orders him to erase it immediately, destroying evidence. Back at Holmes and Watson in Baker Street, Watson is battling a pea.
I'm
Holmes
losing.
recounts last night's events and a woman that he saw in the crowd with a haunting quality. Another anonymous note arrives, and the duo goes to the wharf. Their contact is hiding beneath the wharf they're walking on and tells them that Robert James Leeds, R.I.P. Donald Sutherland, R.I.P. Medium knows more about the Ripper murders and may be of assistance. After Holmes and Watson leave, the duo discover the message that Sir Charles tried to destroy and unravel its true meaning, while their contact, one of the merchants that originally hired them, is stabbed to death with a sword cane by the person spying them on the scene. A fucking sword cane.
Yep.
And we're going to pause there. A
Um,
lot of stuff.
Side note, and you probably know this, but I guess more for the listeners. The reason why sword canes were popular is because upper class men worried about being mugged on the street and wanted to be able to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
if they have to carry a walking stick, they might as well have a sword in there so that way they can defend themselves with it.
You probably didn't know this, but this movie made me fall in love with sword canes. Even though
Really?
it's used by the Ripper, I loved a sword cane for a long time. I, in my teenage years, saved up my money and bought a sword cane, Eddie. I was that kid.
I also owned a sword cane when I was a kid. Yep.
And anyone that owns a sword cane knows those are like flimsy. They're like
Oh god, yeah, they're fucking terrible.
they're enough to give whoever the assailant is to you maybe a paper cut, on a good swing. Like
Could maybe
ouchie.
beat them to death with it, possibly, but
How do you like the hunter's view that they keep giving us of like going through the alleys, literally stalking these women with the killer?
I like it because the one thing this movie's doing that a lot of Sherlock Holmes movies don't do is that it's framing things almost like a horror film,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and it helps to sell the darkness by using a cinematographic language that the audience understands. Like, oh, okay, looking through villain's eyes, this is what horror films tend to do, particularly. We're not quite to the slasher film genre yet, but Halloween's around this time period. A couple other movies around this time period have done this trick. So it's not common, but it's certainly understood. And again, with all the shadowy darkness and the dark sets, it's okay. So we're not quite making a horror film, but we're close to the line. So I really like that because it helps to tell the audience on a subliminal level, this is not just a fun mystery. We're doing something very
Yeah.
different here.
I don't know. I'm torn. I like the concept of it, but then I also am not enjoying the stalking aspect of it for the killings. If you
In what
understand
way?
my meaning.
You don't like
The
seeing it, or
the mix of doing the stalking, and then we have like when he stalks the woman and then he literally strangles her on the doorstep. That
Mhm.
it has a very visceral feel to it that I'm not a big fan of. And I'm curious how that would have even hit in the 70s when someone saw it, because that would have been a totally new and more realistic experience for them. Like now in our time, we are used to a certain degree of movie technology that they were not used to.
right? Um, that's actually interesting because like I don't know how it was pitched to the audiences. I'm actually looking right now. I'm checking out the Murder by Decree movie posters, um, and honestly, they don't look like horror film posters.
No,
So it's interesting. Yeah, it may have been a strong dissonance. Like the one I'm looking at is just Holmes in a crown with an eyeglass, which is pretty common things. Now later depictions of Murder by Decree much more lean into it. When you get into like the DVD releases and later ones, they lean a little more heavily into this is a horror film ish aspect. But the posters of the day certainly didn't seem to.
it doesn't
Uh,
provide a Hammer horror vibe to it.
right, but also this is, I mean, even Hammer horror has a certain amount of kitsch to them,
Yeah,
right? A certain amount of purient excess that gives them a certain kind of different vibe. And this isn't that either, right? It is frankly it's a slasher film just a years too much early for that genre that happens to have Sherlock Holmes in it. Which, if you're trying to sell how horrible Jack the Ripper is, that's not a bad way to go,
yeah.
right? Um, I guess I can see your point of we don't, as the audience, need to be there for that. Um, but I think at least it gives. I think the attempt here is to humanize the victims more. They're not just a convenient meat-based set of clues for Sherlock Holmes to deal with. Right? These are people and they had lives, even however briefly we see them. Um, my mild frustration with that is because all of them were sex workers, that is the only environment we see them in,
Mm-hmm.
which dehumanizes them in a different way. So, in an attempt to humanize them by showing this only in the context of their job and showing that job to be sleazy and unsafe, it doesn't go nearly as far as humanizing them as I think maybe it was intended.
Okay. Well, that's a good point. I also included the jarring scene changes from dark alley streets to opera house to Baker Street to keep the vibe the movie goes. It just sort of gives you like abrupt snippets of scenes and doesn't feel like it transitions very well between them.
Right, right. And weirdly, I mean, Holmes starts out not great in the sense of Holmes is like, these horrible murders are happening. Someone should hire me. It's like, you could just go look, dude. You're Sherlock Holmes. No one's gonna stop you.
Part of it, though, then falls back to the model that would have been somewhat more for the novels, where people come to Holmes in his offices to hire him to go do X or Y. And it feels like that is more of a nod to that before they fully engage Holmes in a very non-Holmesian story.
Right, and I think if this movie had been more about we're going to deconstruct the Holmes structure, I think would have landed better because there's a certain amount of deconstructing Holmes that happens in this movie, but it's not obvious that's the main goal.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think if there's a little more emphasis on, yeah, we're going to take the Holmes character and show that it doesn't sustain in what actual Victorian England was like, that would have been also a very cool and interesting movie. But that's not quite way heavier. Later on, as the movie goes on, that deconstruction starts to kick in, and we see more of it. So I think you're right. There may be a nod towards that, but it lands a bit odd this early in the film.
And for anyone that's curious, if memory serves, for the newspaper people that are delivering newspapers after the opera, is that they delivered papers, I want to say in that time, was it 3 or 5 times a day?
Yeah, there are three or five. There are 3 to 5 different editions.
Yeah. So the newspaper delivery isn't unusual, weird. It's like part of society that happens. And I know it's not something that people may know about now, but
Yeah.
it's a great hook for adventures when you're writing them in scenarios and time frame. So keep that in
hmm
mind.
Yeah, totally.
Love it. And the merchants outside of Baker Street when they show up, and if you can't see it, but I have quotation marks around merchants in the document. How did you like that? How they saw them went inside Baker Street and they were kind of plotting together. I'm trying to get a sense for you, since you know so much of Holmes. Does that match what the characters would have done from what you've read and what you've seen in general
Yeah,
for the characters?
it didn't strike me as odd. Holmes certainly got clients from all levels of society, so that didn't bother me. And actually, I kind of liked it because there is the implicit only the people who are impacted by these actually give a shit, and only merchants of whatever level of legality would have had the money to actually try and hire Holmes. So that makes sense. Like no one at the upper level is going to say, "Oh, I'm." They're going to look at the newspaper. They're going to tut. They're going to clutch their pearls, express their concern, and then go on with their lives. No one's going to go. Actually, maybe I should hire a detective to look into that. Now they're just going to that's sad, and then go on. Whereas, hey, we live around these spaces. Let's try to get him involved, and then it doesn't go well, and so things kind of spiral out of control from that point in time. But the logic makes sense. Holmes has also refused cases before, as we've even seen that.
This is one of the rare times that we've seen Holmes not be able to deduce about the true origins of the people hiring him.
Mm-hmm.
He has an inclination that something's not right, but we don't get that full breakdown of like, there's a dirt undershoe from this district of the town, which means this and Y, X and Y about you. It's
Right.
almost as if his detective skills are toned down for the movie.
Well, again, I think it's a trajectory we've seen. Like we saw a little bit of that in the '60s era, where Holmes made a mistake. Granted, it was a retcon mistake. They added that in to introduce a mistake that Holmes made. But again, in the '70s, there is kind of a attempt of reanalyzing Holmes and making him more fallible. The original stories, he did make mistakes, and don't get me wrong. Um, so what you kind of have is almost like a pendulum. Like you have the original stories where he would occasionally make mistakes, then the Rathbonian era where he was pretty much a superhero. If something came out of his mouth, it was just the God's truth for whatever, unless he was explicitly lying. And then around the '60s, start to swing back towards like we talked about before, like the course to canonical Holmes. Now we're swinging even further, right, to where Holmes is objectively fallible. And so it still feels for me totally correct. This doesn't feel like, oh, this is not Sherlock Holmes, because he gets the important parts right. So if he gets some details wrong, that's okay. And to be honest, what seems to be happening to me is he seems to be failing more when he's showing off, i.e., doing Sherlock Holmes bullshit tricks that we're used
Yeah.
to culturally. So again, I think that leads into the deconstruction of the character of like the more he's showing off and not actually doing the mystery that's important, the more he's going to stumble. But when lives are on the line, he's generally going to more or less get it right. So
Okay.
it's not quite like a full deconstruction, but definitely again, like so, it feels like deconstruction would be a different tone here. It's not quite that, but there's edges of it that are happening.
And the use of the anonymous notes. stood out to me this time watching it because it's plutonium at that point. I give a lot for movies, but the anonymous note bit just really didn't resonate with me now, having
Which
watching it for the podcast, where I'm thinking about how it's going and how the movie's flowing.
I do want to ask, which anonymous notes are you having issue with? Because some of them are actually historically accurate and some aren't.
The anonymous note that first sends him to the crime scene here, and there's another anonymous note later that pops up, and I want to say there's a third one that happens too. It's the three anonymous notes. Maybe one I could let go or two, but it's the constant repetition that Holmes hasn't figured X or Y out, but we need to have Holmes at the scene. So we're going to use this plutonium to get Holmes at the scene. Holmes needs to know X or Y. We're going to use this plutonium to get Holmes here.
Because the note at the crime scene was historically accurate. And Jack did send letters into newspapers to brag about his crimes and give the police clues because he felt the police were too stupid to catch him.
I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the notes
That
that
those
Holmes is receiving. The notes Holmes is receiving from his mysterious unknown contact to get Holmes to go to places where Holmes needs to be to uncover the clues to be able to move the plot along.
Right, exactly. And spoiler for the later on thing, but like it's implied that this is some high class person who's quietly trying to get Holmes to look into it. But we've had, there are other stories that are done this, and the correct quote unquote Holmesian way of doing this is to go in disguise and have Holmes see through your disguise, right? That's the correct way to do this. So yeah, I'm with you. Like, it definitely feels like Holmes is reluctant to actually be in the movie he's in.
Mm-hmm.
And so the notes are like, no, seriously, dude, engage with the plot, please. But again, like I think the intent here is let's add as many layers of mystery as we can onto this relatively well-known historical fact. So if we add new layers to it, quick digression. I think part of this also comes from around this time period. I don't know exactly when. The assertions made in this film were made by ripperologists. I'm not going to give them the name historians, who published a book claiming that the royal family were involved in the Jack the Ripper murders. Right.
Yeah, the movie changed the two names that they explicitly call out in the book.
Right. So I genuinely think the movie thinks it is trying to recreate a historical situation by adding Sherlock Holmes in and trying to stitch together actual history, bullshit history, and Sherlock Holmes, which means that at some point in time, you're just going to have to do some shit to move the plot along, right? And so like, I'm with you. It is the most ham-fisted plot device, and it gets used repeatedly to get Holmes into the plot. But again, you have these things about why wouldn't Holmes, if Holmes existed, why didn't he immediately investigate the first murder and therefore solve the crimes before they got that far? We have to have the crimes hit a certain point because that's what happened historically. So Holmes has to be reluctant to get involved for some reason. And so that's one of the many reasons why I don't like these mashups, is because the more you think about it, the more issues you have.
I can see that. And the other thing is, I think this is something we may have mentioned before, we talked about, but I don't remember. For me, when I'm watching stuff for genreless, I have stuff that I love just in general that I watch as Chris, and then I have to put on my genreless beanie to watch it from a more
I imagine you have an actual
analytical
beanie.
perspective.
Like a little
You know
beanie
what?
with a little propeller in the top.
I'm going to have those made and send them out to us and our guest. And whenever they show up on the podcast, they got to wear the genreless beanie. So we're all on camera together. We can all like go, woo! But I watch it through a more analytical lens. So that means I'm thinking about how things work, how they don't work, and how they repeat
Yep.
certain beats.
Mm-hmm.
And for the anonymous note here, this is a note that sends them to the crime scene. Like, that is a point where I don't think we should have had any more notes, because Holmes has seen the body, is now investigating, and should have now clicked on his home sense. Like, Holmes is, I'm in this now because I have a body. that I've seen. I've been engaged by people that want to pay me. I wanted to do it anyway, but I didn't because we'll say I have other cases.
Right.
That is when the anonymous note should have stopped, and it would have been perfect. And then we let Holmes find clues that lead him to the next step.
Right. Right. So it just comes down to the only ways you can really kind of resolve this are how the movie handled it, to where Holmes is not as good as he thinks he is, or we think he is, which means why I'm watching Sherlock Holmes films, but Sherlock Holmes doesn't do a lot of Sherlock Holmes bullshit, or the mystery is too complex for Sherlock Holmes, and that doesn't feel satisfying.
No.
So destruction of evidence, which again actually happens in the original case, certainly helps some of the lifting here. And so the idea of there's someone who's feeding Holmes information that had been otherwise destroyed does paper it over, but I'm completely with you in a completely unsatisfying way. It should have just been like Holmes has informants that tell him about this, or Holmes stumbles across them as they're destroying the evidence, something to make
The
him a little
bigger
more
should the regulars, you mean?
Yeah, or even have Watson do that role because he has nothing else to fucking do in this movie, right?
That's not true.
It's like no,
Watson carries a beaker. He offers home a revolver multiple times in the movie. Hey, Holmes,
and
take
he
this gun. Hey, Holmes, take
and
this gun.
and Holmes helps him to smash a P because he can't figure out how P technology works.
And he shows off Watson. His great weapon is his scarf with a rock in it. The most Tom Baker Doctor Who-esque scarf ever. I even make a joke about that in the document later, but I love it so much I make it now. At the crime scene, though, it is great to have them there, and you get to introduce to Foxborough, but also the character playing Lestrade. And I thought that was interesting because I did a little bit of reading. Is he played Lestrade in A Case of Terror, and the other Jack the Ripper one from like the 60s.
Oh, okay.
And he's going to show up in Jeremy Brett.
Oh,
So
nice.
3 decades of Holmes at least for this character, for this guy.
That's actually pretty cool. I like that.
How do you like the minimized role though of Lestrade for the movie?
Well, again, like there was an actual well-known detective who was involved in this case. His name wasn't Lestrade. So your options are don't have Lestrade in the movie, which again seems weird if doing a Sherlock Holmes movie because at this point in time, while Holmes has worked with a variety of detectives, at this point in time, Lestrade is kind of cemented as the detective Sherlock Holmes works with.
I don't remember any of the other detectives' names, and I've reread it recently.
Right. Gregson is the only other big one that he tends to work with on a regular basis. And Gregson's kind of had an upswing in popularity in the past few decades. But generally speaking, Lestrade is the most quoted, most cited detective, followed by Gregson, and everyone else is like 1 or 2 stories at most. So if Sherlock Holmes is working with the police, we expect him to work with Lestrade. So Lestrade has to be in the case somehow, but he can't be too much in the case because again, history will play out differently.
Yeah, and for this, they're all corrupt, and we don't want Lestrade to be corrupt.
Right. So
he needs to be a good man working in a bad system.
So it ends up again. It's like you kind of have to find ways to introduce and then minimize the things that people expect to see in a Sherlock Holmes movie.
How did you know what? I want to move. I'm moving away from the murder scene. Is there anything you want to talk about before I move to the P?
No, let's do that. Let's do that.
This is the most jarring scene in the entire movie. Not like the deaths or the stabbings or the underwater or the boat under the dock that I love. Like that is, I'm coming to that in a minute. Top notch.
Yeah.
This P scene, it's out of place completely.
It is. It is. It is the most Rathbonian scene of the whole movie.
Do you feel that the movie would have been too dark if they just cut it completely? Because this is a dark movie. I'm not going to
lie. Probably right. I feel, but I mean, as you say that, that makes the scene feel even more to me like it was almost. Like I wouldn't be surprised to find out that was shot later. Yeah, the studio's like, "Hey, you need to add a comedy scene here because we test screened it and it was too dark." It feels bolted on. I've always felt it felt a bit bolted on. It's even lit differently, right? Like if you look at the rest
Yeah,
of the movie, it's the most brightly lit scene I think in the whole movie. Um,
because without it, if we stop and think about it, it's minor. If you, it can be a minor spoiler for us in a minute, but you get the jab that Watson makes at the start of the movie with Holmes in the opera house,
mhm.
and the Watson arrest scene with Lestrade. I think those are like the other two big comical moments. And the arrest scene is long, the jab is short, and then that's
Right, and I'm picking on this scene because it's weird. I actually do like the scene because uh, I like to think of myself as a relatively intelligent person, and I sometimes miss really obvious solutions to problems. You know, so I empathize with Watson a bit here, not necessarily in this exact case, but like in general. It's like sometimes this has to be the way to do it, and say, oh, I could have just done this thing differently and made my life much easier. So like conceptually, I actually like the scene. It's just not. I don't think this scene should be in this movie. I think the humor should have stayed on the interpersonal. And while this scene is trying to be another interpersonal comedy scene, it's a little too reliant on physical comedy for it to land. I think
yeah.
I think it's the physical component of the joke that makes it jar.
No, that's perfect. That explains it. Thank you. Huh. Uh, this is also the point where I'm going to point out that for most of the Holmes and Watson I felt here, I've alluded to that I think that they are doing it because they're in a relationship. For Plummer and Mason, I do not feel that they're in a relationship, like at
Wow,
all. I don't get that at all from these two. It's like,
this is the
nah.
first time you've got that, huh?
From every other Holmes, yeah. They're, in the end, those characters are going to get married or settle down somewhere together in a little cottage and live their lives after they get done kicking Crumb's butt. These two, I don't get that feeling.
Um, I will say I will agree with you in the sense that Watson is at his most frustrated roommate state of the ones we've seen so far.
Yeah.
That is definitely the vibe I get at this point in time. Of like, I like you, I respect you, but Jesus Christ, you fucking pissed me off as I live with you. Which I like, but also, yeah, I'm with you. Like the chemistry is just not quite there.
And I don't know if it's simply because most of the things that we've watched have been a series, so they've had time to develop that chemistry versus this being just a one movie. They come in, they do their gig, and then they leave.
Maybe. I don't think it's entirely true because we also watched the first two Rathbone and Bruce movies when they hadn't had time to develop that chemistry. We saw it there pretty much immediately.
No, it's true. Huh. All right. So frustrated roommates here.
Yep.
Another anonymous note
Yes.
sends him to the dock. And as much as I give that anonymous note some crap, I love this scene. I love the
Hmm.
scene of the guy in the boat under them trying to figure out what's going on, and he's providing them another clue while they're being watched. And Watson has a moment. He makes his perception check and knows someone's there, but can't find them. And Holmes is talking to him, and the guy in the boat then just sort of goes off, and you think he escapes before he's killed.
Hmm. Yeah.
Beautifully done.
It's a great way to express the mystery of stuff while giving Holmes information he needs to progress and making it visually interesting. That's actually a pretty challenging set of things to resolve. So yeah, the movie did a great job on all fronts.
And this is another point that so they go back to Baker Street after that. They don't know that their contact has been killed. Holmes makes a solution to go uncover writing on the wall. Now, I don't think the movie explicitly states it, but are we to believe that the contact told them that the police destroyed evidence and Holmes now corrects this by making his solution that Watson carries, giving Watson a role to read the message?
I feel like that is implicit, yes, because we did see the police destroying the inscription. Uh, and it's like again a weird jarring moment because like in any other Holmes adaptation we've seen so far, Holmes like I made a magical chemical solution to cover this clue is a perfectly viable thing even if it makes no scientific sense. Because this movie's trying really hard to stay grounded in reality, that jumps out a bit. It's like, because, and granted, some of this might be my own knowledge. We never actually see the inscription, but I know from knowing the Jack River case, that's chalk. They just rub chalk off of a stone wall. So how does a chemical allow you to undo removing chalk from a stone wall, right? If anything, it's a chemical. It's going to do the opposite. It's going to make it even more removed. So it makes no a damn bit of sense. And any other adaptation, I wouldn't care. Like, sure, whatever, magical chemical thing, great. But in this, it's like, but how? But what? No, that's not how that works.
It's the tactile strength of the person right now. I got nothing. Thank you for saying that. That did remind me that there is another comical beat here that doesn't land. It's Holmes showing Watson, I made my Baker joke about the scarf, and he throws it over his shoulder and breaks a beaker. And you hit the nail on the head. It is a physical humor that's not working for me as I watch this. Because that's on the physical humor bit, and it's not funny. The P isn't really funny. It's
Right.
That's not working. Thank you. Open up the whole movie.
There you go. And again, they feel very studio mandated.
The following day at Lee's Manor, the medium claims to have had a vision of Jack the Ripper and his hansom cab and one of the victims. Miss Lee says the police didn't believe them and says the next victim was Annie Chaplin. Lee says he encountered the Ripper in person on a bus and tried to pursue the killer only to be dismissed by the police again. Sir Charleston's Foxborough, they gank Holmes out of Lee's homes. Holmes is interrogated by Sir Charles in the morgue of the body of Macon, his former informant, the guy in the boat, who turns out to have been a radical, and Sir Charles threatens to arrest Holmes. I'm pausing. Eddie, what is a radical in Victorian times here? And that'll become important, if you know.
Basically anybody who's anti-monarchy.
Okay.
I mean, there are subsets. There's anarchists who generally believe that no government should be in control. There are the Fenians, which believe that Ireland should be self-rule. So there are different flavors of radical, but generally speaking, as far as this movie is concerned, radical is just kind of anti-monarchy.
Would this be similar to in the audio one that we listened to, the group of people and the woman in her anarch society of helping poor people?
Yes.
Radical.
Yes, that would be equivalent.
Cement people with stuff. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on now. Side note, just for people, because I wanted to make sure they understood. The guard that threw both Holmes and Watson off the dock last night come in to basically say that nope, they didn't kill anybody. Much to Sir Charles's chagrin, he's upset. He leaves. Holmes goes into Sir Charles's office as Watson. He deduces that he is a Freemason, does some weird hand signals that freak out Sir Charles that Holmes may be a higher rank Freemason than he is. Freemasons are a secretive order, so they remove the writing from the wall to cover up some of their other people because there are certain words in it that let Holmes know about Freemason lore. Holmes recounts the Freemason history to Watson. He knows that the women are friends, and he knows that all the women who have been killed are friends of each other, and that Watson should go and try to find some of her living friends. Holmes, in disguise, infiltrates Lee's home that is now under police surveillance to get the rest of Lee's adventure hunting Jack the Ripper. While Watson interviews the victim's friends in a pub, they advise him that Mary Kelly may know more, and Watson follows a woman down the street. They try to pull a scam that goes awry for all of them.
Now, this is one time where I'm glad you encouraged. Well, I'm glad we agreed. Let's put it that way. To rewatch this movie, because I had always been the impression, and in my head, this was the movie where Sherlock Holmes was a Freemason. And rewatching it, I realized no, he's not a Freemason. He simply knows a lot about them and can bullshit Freemasons, which
and
lands way better for me.
It.
Way better for me. Yes.
Love it. Because it makes sense for Holmes, who would have gone and learned all those things. He could potentially had a Freemason have hired him, and in exchange, he learned some of their different things. So it's another tool in Holmes's box.
Right. The one piece that's not really stated, but the movie doesn't contradict, so I think it's fine, is that there were a ton of these secret societies around, right? The Freemasons were
Yeah.
not like unique in this front. Um, Rich dudes were really into pretending like they were part of secret societies. The Freemasons were the most well known, but even the movie
Secretive
itself,
society.
right, it clarifies it's not a secret society, it's a secretive society. Um, uh, so I think it's a nuance that maybe was lost on the average audience member, but also doesn't really matter. The movie works either way. I'm understanding it's not like it's a huge problem. It's more just like when I first watched it, I don't think I was watching it as closely, and so I was just like, ah, Holmes is a Freemason. That's fucking stupid. And now I'm watching it again and say, oh, okay, that makes way more sense. Is that Holmes was like, huh? At some point in time, I may have to do Freemasons. I should probably know about them. Spent a rabbit hole obsessing about Freemasons for a few days, and it's like, cool. I know. I now know all of Freemasonry now.
And you're right. There were so many secret societies that you couldn't throw a rock or not trip over one. Whole bunch of analogies I can make. Um, the Medium,
Love it.
the incredible Donald Sutherland. You loved
Love it.
it.
Love it. Love it.
Why? Tell me why you love a psychic in a Sherlock Holmes mystery, Mr. Webb.
Because you can't throw a rock, not hit a member of a secret society. You can't throw a rock, not hit a medium at this point in time, right? And I like the fact that the movie never clarifies if he has actual powers or not, which is good. Ultimately, he happened to be on an omnibus with somebody, and that's the big thing. But everyone's like, "Oh, you're a medium, so we're going to discount your," which is I think is valid. Um, so the fact that he's in here, he's a medium, and the fact that he actually, as far as we know, has no supernatural powers, I really love it. He's just a guy pulling his hustle.
But then why would the killer have threatened him?
That doesn't mean that other people in the world didn't, or other people at the time didn't believe that mediums had actual power.
Okay. I know. I like giving a little stick because, in case anyone's curious, there was an entire like spiritual awakening era, and even Abe Lincoln's wife, I forgot her name now because I'm still early in the morning, had a medium that would come to the White House on the payroll. There's everywhere. Unbelievable. It's incredible. If you haven't read up on it, go and read it. It is fascinating.
I think Queen Victoria had a court medium for a while.
It's incredible. I love the medium because I like psychics and I like having supernatural bits in some of my history, as may be well known. But I think he does have power, and I think it alludes to him having visions. And it's not so much, it's a mix of visions, but I think it's more of an intuition, almost like he is a detective like Holmes, and
Right.
he's logically putting things together. So it could be powers, or it could just be the power of deduction,
Right.
which is what Holmes is about, and
That's
goes
what I mean.
why Holmes comes back.
I like the fact the film leaps at nebulous.
And yeah, but it also shows you that Holmes and Watson are being followed by the police, because that's why Sir Charles could instantly have them pulled out by Foxborough to come when he needs it, which reinforces Holmes mentioning earlier that they were being followed. So it gives you that context without having to restate it again, how they'll do later in the movie, in case you missed it.
Right, but again, this is where you have to look at this movie as a reinvention of both Holmes and Jack the Ripper, because this was 1888, which from the original stories is relatively early in Holmes's career. So either you should have gone with he's just some punk ass detective no one knows about, and so the police don't trust him that way, and then you don't need Lestrade. Or you go, he is trusted by the police, but there's this cadre of police officers that are all corrupt and working against Holmes. But that cadre seems to be literally every other officer we see on screen. So is Lestrade the outs? Is basically Lestrade one of the few good men?
He's
Is it
Commissioner
just
Gordon.
right? Yeah. It's or is it just the Whitechapel chunk is corrupt because Lestrade is central London? There needed to be some kind of explanation of how what Holmes's relationship with the police fits into all of this, and it's just never really handled well.
No, agreed. Because it couldn't just be Whitechapel because Sir Charles is head of Scotland Yard. They state like Scotland Yard, head, all of it.
Right, right.
Hmm. I like I said, I like the bit about Holmes freaking him out, thinking he's a higher level Mason. The Watson interviewing people in the pub. Oh, oh, the teeth scene, Eddie. It lingers so long on that, so long.
I loved how unsexy that whole scene is. Like in a lot of those other scenes or style scenes, um, when the man's like, "No, thank you," kind of they're just. I think the intent is always kind of the he's pushing himself to not be seduced by this situation, and at least I watching is like, "No, I'm with Watson. I want to get the fuck out of here. This is just no."
But
Please God, no.
why would he then go with her outside down a dark alleyway? I It
Because he's
doesn't make any
chivalrous.
sense.
No, because Watson is still chivalrous, man. And because he prides himself as chivalrous, and so if a lady needs to be escorted, regardless of what that lady is, definition of quote unquote lady, or even his opinions of them, he will still do that.
She does not need to be escorted. She literally says, "Let's go somewhere more comfortable." What other language do you need? I am totally pro sex worker. I think they should have full health care. They should be
Right.
paid more. And if someone comes up to you, Eddie, and they have their hand in your crotch and say, "Let's go somewhere more comfortable," I don't give a fuck about you saying it's chivalrous. You do not get up and walk with that person down a dark alley unless there is going to be some other sort of exchange of fluids occurring, because that is a business transaction you're at now.
I, I, this is a point where I recognize that my defense of what's not being idiot falls apart a bit.
Yes.
Because he's dumb. Um, I still stand by the fact is I think it's a case of him going, I'm just going to escort you home, and we'll stop doing this, not realizing that that's not how this is going to go. But I also recognize the film is super unclear as what's actually happening here. I'm trying to put a emphasis and context onto a scene that, frankly, is just Watson being groped, going, "Please, please don't do that." She's like, "I want to go fuck," and he going, "Okay, let's do that." That's basically how the scene reads.
Oh, and I loved it when it changed into the con about Watson being in an alleyway with a woman and they're going to tell his wife. And you get Watson saying, "Sorry, mate, you got the wrong guy," and beats a guy down.
Right, right.
Like that was a nice little bit of humor too.
Yeah, like, and I kind of like the humor of Watson's trying to interrogate people and accidentally gets sucked into a completely different scam, right? I actually thought that was great. Um, the whole thing would have been solved if it just been like Watson isn't married yet, because technically speaking, uh, uh, Sign of the Four doesn't happen until 1890, so he's technically not even married yet. So they have to solve the whole thing by him just saying, "No, I don't want to," and then going, "Okay, yes, I guess I do want to," and then like, "You'll tell your wife I'm not even married, mate," and then.
And now here with you, and you're recounting like the years specifically when things happen. The movie feels now. I definitely see the dissonance. It feels wrong because these
Yeah,
Holmes and Watsons feel more established, like they're
right.
part of this world for a long time, and it's because the actors they chose.
Yep.
After Night in jail, Watson recounts his tale to Holmes as they whiteboard the investigation. The victims all live within a few streets and know each other. Holmes tasks Watson to uncover the person Lee told him about, but doesn't know the name of the person. While Holmes attends a funeral of Catherine Eddowes and talks to the woman from the previous evening, Kelly. She has a secret that has gotten everyone that she's told killed by them. and she's on the run. She knows where the baby is. Annie Crook gave her the baby before she got shut away. It says that Eddy still loves her. She begs Holmes for help before he's incapacitated by a charging hansom cab and Kelly's kidnapped. Holmes awakens later in bed to Watson treating him for a possible concussion. Detective Foxborough states that someone was trying to kill him. Holmes weakly gets up, and both Holmes and Watson visit Annie Crook in the asylum, who is treated by Sir Thomas Spivey, a court physician. And Holmes knows that they're being used. Crook tells Holmes of the story that befell her and her baby. Holmes is driven to tears by the tragic fate and his inability to help the woman. On the ride back to London, Holmes realizes why they weren't followed, that it's too late for Crook, and that it may be too late for Kelly if they don't find her tonight.
I love the fact that both of our names are in this chunk of the movie.
Yes.
That did not go unnoticed by me when I watched this.
Good. I didn't even bold them in the document because I thought it would be more fun this way.
And no, I noticed that when I was watching. I was just like, "Oh God, okay, yeah, let's mention that." I also weirdly love a good Sherlock Holmes chalkboard scene. They're pretty rare, actually. Of him just like, he's a whiteboard. Basically, yeah, just like, I'm just draw some shit and point at it.
I almost called it a murder board.
Yeah.
But they didn't have little.
Right. But it's damn close.
But it would make sense, because how else would you be able to explain it, at least to Watson, as you're thinking through it together as a team?
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and I know it's canonical that Sherlock Holmes has some kind of slate, at least, because he uses it in Dancing Men. So a lot of times people just go, okay, it's just a full like teacher's chalkboard. And why not? Why wouldn't Sherlock Holmes have a full fucking chalkboard in his office? It just makes perfect sense, right? Because he needs to visually show to the person watching the movie what he's thinking. But it works. And when it's done well, like in this case, it's done well, I genuinely love it.
So what this movie does is it shows that someone, as you said earlier, did their homework, not only into like the setting, but also specifically into Holmes and the canon, to be able to tell the story and then do some deconstruction with it. It's something that I said during Marvel. You need to have someone that knows, and it feels like loves the subject matter before you can break it down.
Yep.
And then it like feels authentic.
And little things like the map he draws is pretty accurate to that chunk of Whitechapel at that time and who was located where. So I mean, like, someone clearly was, like I said, paying attention.
I enjoyed the comedy scene with Lestrade, Holmes, and Watson. That was a nice touch. The closest we get, like the three of them together having a friendship moment, because they would be friends or friendly enough to do that.
Right.
And we needed that after some of the other stuff.
I recognize this is not the kind of movie it's trying to be, but there's certainly when Foxborough was like, someone's trying to kill you. I just really feel like Holmes should have been like, yeah, no shit. You know? Because like, you know, he's wake, what's going on? You may have a concussion. Foxborough's like, someone's trying to kill you. It's like, no, I think someone came by just to give him a concussion. Didn't want to kill him, just want to make sure he had a concussion and then moved on. Of course he tried to fucking kill him. Jesus Christ. Do you not know what story you're in, Foxborough?
But then if we're to go down that route, it's how quiet is a hansom cab charging down a cobblestone street? Can you not hear it a ways away?
Well, the reason why,
the
Chris,
horse
is because
like silenced.
Because of the 70s sound design, it's so muted you can't hear the horse coming up on you.
It's that's it. I'm gonna write a Holmes scenario now, and I'm gonna kill somebody with a hansom cab. Just gonna do it.
I just throw it at them. Just
no one. They didn't even hear it coming. I'm gonna have the horse have like supersonic little hooves, so it doesn't make any noise on the street.
No, just like felt on the shoes,
or have like a cone of silence over the hansom cab itself.
Better yet, have the horse like have like a ninja mask and black footies, so like a ninja horse.
I'm not going to say why you made that joke. People have to wait until something else happens to show how out of order we are. I loved the Annie Crook scene. Like, this is a point where you get to see Holmes really be human. Christopher Plummer has done a good job of portraying little snippets, but where Holmes finally breaks and even like tries to strangle a physician because he can't do anything.
Right. In particular, this is one of the moments where having Sherlock Holmes here is actually kind of an inspired choice because he is a character who's well known for not liking and or trusting women, regardless of what spin you put on that. Right. He's been established repeatedly through a variety of media that he doesn't just fall in love with women. That's not the kind of character he is. So when he has this emotional reaction in another character, it can read like he is weirdly in love with this woman or has some kind of sexual attraction to her or anything. None of that is present because we know it's Sherlock Holmes. He's just outraged at how a human being can be treated like this. It's pure his frustration with the injustice, and
Mm-hmm.
it reads really well. Plummer does a fantastic job portraying that.
Oh. Anything else about the actual plot? The reason why this happened before we move on?
Um,
In that bastard Eddie.
I do like the I'm ignoring that. I do like the bit of how they make it up front that like Holmes is like or maybe a slightly later scene, but it's around this scene where Holmes is like, no, she's not insane. She's just been shoved in here to get her out of the way, which is very much a thing that happens.
Yeah.
And
And
I
being
like that.
there for that amount of time is
Right, yeah, and so it's a beautiful moment because you go there and it's like she's acting like someone who has lost her mental faculties, and then Holmes puts that spin on it, like, no, she was fine when she got here. Now she's like this. This place made her that, which totally recontextualizes the asylum system in Victorian England, which again, you and I, as history fans, know what that's like. But people just
yes.
watching this film casually, they're like, "Oh, this is bad." It's like, yes, it is bad.
And you get the entire reason why everything has happened between here and from Kelly probably within 5-10 minutes of the movie that you've watched up to now, which
Yep.
gives you now going to be at the climax of the movie is what's going to happen after this.
Hmm.
And I think it's easy to put together what's happened. The mystery itself isn't overly complicated. I read some people reviews talking about the movie itself from the time, and they were saying that it's a good, some people called it a good romp and it was fun, but it's not
What?
complicated. Yes.
Romp is not a word I would use to describe this film.
I don't remember the review, but they called it a romp. And some people were saying that Plummer's portrayal of Holmes was bad. The only good part is going to be Mason. So I don't know if it was the
Hmm.
actual acting, if it was just because the actors in that year that had different love for them compared to other people. It's mixed reviews. It's so interesting to read through. I may start trying to do that for all of our movies just to give more context for me.
Yeah, but I mean, based on that and what we were looking at earlier, more and more, I think maybe this movie was just either pitched to the audience badly or the audience were not on board with where this character was evolving into, right? Because like I
Mm-hmm.
said, this is kind of a fallow period for Sherlock Holmes, generally speaking. So a lot of people are going, "Oh yeah, I remember, you know, watching the original '40s films, or I remember, seeing them reruns on TV, or maybe I watched the occasional '60s episode." Um, and maybe came to expecting to see that, and they got something very different. And so, a lot of people who aren't like us don't analyze things to death. Are probably just going, "Oh, that was a bad film. That film sucked."
Funny enough, you didn't have anyone that saw the Ron Howard version of that
Right.
saying, "Oh, '50s, that was my Holmes."
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But I mean,
Even
to
you
the
forgot
time,
about poor Ronald Howard.
no, I didn't. I didn't. I was just kind of trying to summarize real quick. Um,
Uh, anything else before I move on?
who's Ronald Howard again? I don't remember. I'm kidding.
Back in London, we discover Sir Charles has resigned. Detective Foxborough is nowhere to be found, and Lestrade is at his wits' end. Once more, we're in killer view, stalking and killing before going back to Holmes and Watson, scouring the cobblestone streets, with someone following them from the shadows. They quickly uncover their trail. It's Foxborough. And Holmes accused him of being the true informant and head of a radical movement. And Foxborough agrees. He doesn't care about the women at all, but he wants to show that the government is corrupt and it should be brought down to its knees, and Holmes is the man to do it. Women, killer, be damned. Government first must go. He claims everyone uses Holmes, who threatens to kill him if Kelly dies. Watson is disgusted by the thought of a radical in Scotland Yard and the government being involved. Sheer up-and-lippedness. Holmes burst in on the killers over the body with blood on their faces and flames everywhere. He is saved by Watson, who takes a flaming poker to the shoulder. Holmes gives chase on the dark streets, finding the accomplice killed by Jack the Ripper and with his fucking sword cane. Foxborough is also dispatched by the fucking sword cane. Is this thing blessed? Is it a magic weapon? How did he get it a sword cane in D&D? As Holmes arrives too late to aid him, Holmes, much like Doctor Who, breaks out his scarf to do battle. We get the best fight scene to date in our Sherlock Holmes run. Criminal versus consultant. Holmes versus killer. Sword cane versus scarf. As he dispatches the killer, he passes out in Lestrade's arms. His words, "Help Watson." True love, maybe? Could it be? As Lestrade casts Cure Light wounds on Holmes, saving him. I'm pausing there.
I mean, I think you're doing it as a joke, but you're not wrong. This actually is the best action scene we've seen to date.
It was. I thought about it. I was like, the action. I'm not saying it's great. I'm saying it's the best action we've seen. And it's
Right.
like,
Well, I mean, but again, we're starting to see the seeds of Holmes as action hero, which has always been there, but they're starting to come out more now. Again, we're going to see that blossom and occasionally fade again over our run here. But yeah, there's a straight up there's a fight scene because that's the kind of thing you should have in these kinds of movies.
so in case anyone is curious, there was not an easy synopsis for me to just take and tweak for Holmes. I had to write this from start to finish, if you can't tell by the
Yes.
snippets of humor that are already in here. And Eddie's giggling because I don't think he read the document yet, which brings me joy.
I,
Whew.
I, Foxborough, mate. Okay, I'm the head of a radical organization. I want to overthrow the government. My plan involves getting hired by the government and showing they're incompetent by being incompetent in my job that I got hired to do. You're the government, Foxborough.
Oh, now there's something to be said for trying to go into the government and changing it from within. But if your plan is to overthrow the government from within, then you need to ingratiate yourself more than Foxborough's done, because we've already have detectives up till now saying that Foxborough fellow is an odd bird. Like from day one, that's what we hear.
Right.
So he automatically isn't going to make contacts or friends.
No, it's like the movie is going out of its way to be like, this guy's suspicious. And so it turns out he's the radical we've been looking for all along. And it's just like, okay, I guess, but your plan sucks, man. And like,
Ugh.
it would be like one thing if like he's just bad at being a radical, right? He's a radical, but he's just like, he's the runt of his litter. And it's like, okay, cool, great. He's just a garbage police detective and a garbage radical. Great, fine. But that's not how it's played. It's played like this was his master plan that he was one step away from completing, and Sherlock Holmes uncovered it. And it's like, so.
But he's obviously a decent radical. He hired people. He's gotten Holmes 2 crime scenes with fucking anonymous notes. He got Holmes not to be arrested. He's done the little bits the plot needed him to do.
Sure, but like, okay, so let's not even put
Garbage police,
modern day politics
radical.
on. Just talk about contemporary politics here, right? It's my plan to overthrow the government is to show the populace that the police don't work. They already had that opinion, buddy. You need to help that along, because even at the time, people were like, "There's a serial killer in our streets. The police are not stopping this. Why the fuck not?" right? That was already happening.
See, the only way that his plan would work is if he knew the killer or the association was with the Prince of Wales. It's the only way it
Right.
would work. But he doesn't know that.
Right. It's one step from being a genuinely clever twist, but it because it's pitched slightly off, the whole thing falls apart. The whole thing feels like someone got 100 pages in the script and went, "Oh shit! I never explained where those notes came from, did I? God damn it! Well, sure, it's Foxborough, I guess."
Oh, Eddie, I want a sword cane again. I don't know why, but I suddenly have the urge to go buy a sword cane again.
Right. And then Holmes just finds the fucking killers. He just goes in there, just like staring at him, like, "Oh shit." I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a genuinely tense scene, but the first shot of the guy with the knife up in his hand, covered in blood, staring at Holmes. I swear to God, it looks like he's about to say, "This is what it looks like." You know?
Oh god. So, but the bursting in part, if you're playing a game, that is very much what a player would do.
Oh no,
Like, we don't
totally.
need to plan. Bam, we're in here. And Holmes almost gets dispatched right there, if not for his loyal sidekick Watson.
No, I mean, I was laughing hard because you're making the RPG references. Right, this is the most RPG scene of this whole movie. It's the game master's like, the players are not getting it. Okay, look, what door are you kicking in? Great, the killers are there. Sure, all right. Now here's the fight scene I've been trying to get you to do for 30 minutes.
That's why I had to do it. I couldn't help myself. And we get a lot of running around cobblestone streets. There's following. This is where you could see the money, I think, was beginning to break down. They're running out of funding. So we get the same little streets running around in circles for there to the climactic fight scene. And Holmes, technically, but not really, killing the killer, because the killer gets caught up in a net and dies,
yeah,
which lets
yeah,
Holmes not be a killer for us, the audience.
right. But also, and to the actor's credit, Holmes looks like he's conflicted about saving him. Right. It's not like Holmes is just like, "Nope, not my problem anymore." I mean, he's like, "I should, maybe I shouldn't, I don't know." And that moment of hesitation, the killer dies. So I think it's played well, right? I can't actually even make fun of that. It's genuinely done well. It is just, however, a bit of, "Oh shit, we're running out of runtime. Let's quickly throw all this together." Which, and again, if the movie had stopped here, I would hate this movie a lot more.
Yeah. It's the next scenes that makes the movie for me.
Correct, right. The fact is that there's the next scene, and what they do with the next scene saves all of this, because you find out that actually stopping Jack the Ripper was not really the point, which is, again, one of the few reasons why I think this movie is elevated above the other adaptations, is because it recognizes that there's no way that actually capturing Jack the Ripper is satisfying.
All right, I'm
Holmes
going to
has
go
to do
ahead and
something
go
else.
on,
Right.
because I think that we both want to move on.
Yeah, okay. Let's do that.
Can you believe that Foxborough got dispatched with a sword cane? He walked around the corner, he got stabbed. That was it. I mean, like, dead. Later, Holmes is before the Prime Minister, Sir Charles, and the Home Secretary, all Freemasons. He calls them out for their secrecy, and we learn that Holmes has contacted the Prime Minister. They've summoned him to silence him because he's made claims that could rock the very nation. They threaten him. He acknowledges that they'll take action based on what they've done so far in this case, referencing Annie Cook and the women that have been killed. He recounts what occurs, stating that Annie Cook, who the Home Secretary instantly recognizes her name, fell in love with Albert Victor Christian, the heir of the throne of England, known as Eddy, who took advantage of her, faked a marriage with her. She bore a child, and then when others discovered the child was Catholic, the government became concerned. The Prime Minister made it known that it would be better if the woman didn't exist, and the killers struck. Putting Crook in the asylum, the hunt for Kelly commenced. They murdered anyone who knew of the child, and they thus began the myth of Jack the Ripper. Holmes admits and regrets that he led them to Kelly, who they killed, and she never revealed where the child was. The Prime Minister says he must prove these accusations. Holmes accuses the dead and then drops a shit ton of evidence against everyone in the room and the Freemasons. Holmes dismisses the validity of some threats against the crown that never existed. Ultimately, he promises to keep silent while long as the child remains safe. The Prime Minister states they don't know the location of the child and it will remain so, and that Crook took her own life after meeting with Holmes. And Holmes doesn't believe him. Holmes states that he'll always have the death of Kelly on his conscience, and the Prime Minister will have the death of all those other women on his. We end on a somber note with Holmes and Watson in Baker Street, with their friendship the only light in a dark world.
And yeah, this is definitely one of the movies where the ending not only saves it but also elevates it.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Holmes' speech to them is the best part of this entire movie.
Yep. It's Sherlock Holmes versus classism is really what this movie is. We realized the end. It's the upper classes can do whatever the fuck they want to, and even Sherlock Holmes can't entirely defeat that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really strong. And so retroactively, we see kind of what the movie's been trying to do is that it's not really deconstructing Holmes. What it's doing instead is that it has to make the audience aware of the human side of Holmes for this speech to land correctly. This is not a Sherlock Holmes who loves the puzzle. This is Sherlock Holmes who wants justice done, realizes not only he cannot do justice, but in this case, he never could have done justice. There was no possible solution for him. And so he does the only thing he can do, which is holding the men that are ultimately responsible to account to the best of his ability.
And while we made fun earlier of the 70s sort of cinematography and slimy feel to some of the things associated with it and the sound and everything else, but the era of the 70s in most mediums had made a change. And this about people fighting against corrupt structures was the core of that change. And
yes.
It's in comics, it's in movies, it was everywhere. And this movie resonated with that perfectly.
Mm-hmm. No, it is definitely, this movie could not have been made in any other decade. I mean, after the 70s maybe, but like before, it could have been made before the 70s. Not in this way. And particularly because Holmes, the perfect balance of Holmes's passionate drive for justice and also his logical deconstruction works perfectly with kind of the zeitgeist of the 70s, which is that we now see these injustices, and if we just get other people to see it too, we can get through this. We now know that's not how it works, but that's very much what the 70s thought they could do.
Yeah, it doesn't.
But it fits in exactly with the 70s mentality.
So I still love this movie. It is not a happy movie by any measure of it, but this is the Sherlock Holmes that I've watched, I think, the most because of my grandmother. I mentioned at the top of the thing as a kid, and it's probably why I got into reading Holmes and enjoy the Sherlock Holmes genre and getting to see the different versions of Holmes. I still like a humanized version of Holmes that is a mix of logic and rage.
Right. Yeah. You might know, Matthew, when did Watergate happen?
Ugh. I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say it was 74-ish, but I'm probably off.
That's all that matters. Because I'm with you. Like the first time I watched it, like 2/3 of the way through, I was just like, ugh, what is this movie? And then after I watched it the first time, I kind of realized, oh, this is supposed to be an analogy to Watergate, right? Which is, someone has uncovered a conspiracy that the higher ups are performing, and is trying
Watergate
to
scandal, 72 to 74.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, this feels very very much like it feels like a stab at Watergate, or at least that was in the air, right? This is the bold that eventually leads to the X-Files, if you will. So once I realized that, when I watched it the second time, that's why initially I was like, but if Holmes is a Mason, he's part of the exact same power structures that he's trying to overthrow. Now it makes more sense to me that he wasn't. He was simply taking on the trappings of power to try to get them to reveal themselves, which is much more Sherlock Holmes. Is the I will say and do whatever it fucking takes to get me to where I need to be to solve the crime. Which, in a lot of ways, this Holmes feels a little more authentic than even the '60s Holmes we watched, because the
Absolutely.
core of the character is here. The trappings were present and correct in the '60s, but the core of the character is here present in '79, and that's what this decade is fascinating for us, because it is people kind of rediscovering who Sherlock Holmes really was, not just this clever eccentric that solves weird puzzles, but this angry, passionate, emotional man who covers up his emotions to try to get the job done, but he doesn't. It's not because he doesn't care; it's because he cares too much.
Mm-hmm. Because I almost feel the Rathbone Holmes was more of an adventurer.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Ronald Howard Holmes was more of a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the '60s Holmes was more of like a robot that only cared about the case.
Yeah.
And this is my home out of the ones we've seen.
Yes. And perhaps satisfyingly, this is the core of the interpretation of Holmes that's going to persist for a while. We're going to see the other versions of Holmes are going to linger around the edges, but the idea of Holmes as an actual person, Holmes with emotions, Holmes with passion, is one that's going to persist for a good long time. So there's definitely a significant change. And so it's weird. And I find it fascinating that this part where Holmes hasn't really done a lot of is also a point where Holmes makes a very strong pop culture shift. So it's almost an invisible change that we don't really see the payoffs for until the '80s.
Since any other closing thoughts, because I think that was a great one to end
Um, just the fact that it is interesting to note that we have watched. This is like the shortest, I think, of a material I've watched. It's only 2 hours, but we've talked probably the longest about this movie, because frankly, there's just more to dig in here. This is where, frankly, this is where Sherlock Holmes gets interesting. And so it's a good time to kind of take a break for a minute.
on.
Just a nice cliffhanger. It's like, just Sherlock Holmes got interesting, so let's not talk about that for a bit.
That's the best way to go. Because we've mentioned before that one of the things we like to do is we need a little break somewhere to recharge ourselves so we don't get tired of what we're digging into. So it lets us reboot.
Exactly.
Do we want to tell them how we're rebooting, or we just want to let them deal in suspense for a
No,
week?
no. Let's. Well, actually, slightly longer than that. So as Chris mentioned, alluded to, we've recorded this slightly out of order, but friend of the show, Matthew Dawkins, reached out to us and said he really, really, really wanted to talk about, of all things, Mortal Kombat Conquest, which was a television show
Test
from the
your
late
might.
'90s. Yes, it was a kind of prequel to the first movie, not really, sort of. That was I didn't even know really existed until they started talking to us about it.
Are you saying it's a
And
post prequel?
postquel, maybe, I don't know. There's a term for that. I don't even know. Threequel, whatever. Suffice to say, we ended up talking for quite a long time about this terrible, terrible television show. So we're gonna have a two-parter special coming up for the next 2 weeks. So if you're interested, it is apparently, we found out during the course of recording that it is on Max, because Chris found this
Yeah.
out. So it's not as hard to find. So episodes 1, 10, 15, and 22 are the ones we covered. So that's going to be our break, is talking about scantily clad ninjas for 2 weeks. And then we'll come back to go into the '80s Sherlock Holmes. And
Talk
Chris,
about scantily clad Holmeses.
yes, no, that's later, I think. Ever? Yes. Well, technically speaking, there was one, but we won't go into that. Now, Chris, do you want to tell us which Sherlock Holmes we're going to talk about next in the '80s?
There's so many jokes I could make now. I don't know where to
I
go.
know. We're just gonna skip right over them.
Ah, damn it. I had the perfect name for that poor Sherlock Holmes movie, Steve. All right, never mind. We're going to jump into the Jeremy Brett Holmes. I'm not going to tell you which ones because you'll have to read in the description because I don't have the document up unless Eddie's going to be nice and tell
I
you.
do. It is season 1, episode 12, which is the Red-Headed League. Season 2, episode 3, which is Second Stain, and season 2, episode 4, the Musgrave Ritual.
Because
On it.
I'm professional enough that when I'm done reading, I close the document so I can just like free will it up until then.
I don't do it until this recording's done because I know you. You have tricked me before, so I am ready now.
Oh god. So as we're going to be taking a little bit of a break from Holmes, I've enjoyed the Holmes run up till now. It was fun doing it, seeing the differences between all the different homes and having a conversation with you and getting to see you geek out about something you really love.
Thank you. I appreciate it because I admit I don't often, as much as we all have our fandoms and like talking about them, Sherlock Holmes is niche enough amongst my friends. I don't get a chance to really dig into it like this. So I've appreciated the time to it. And also, I think this has been a good run because to me, the best run of genres is when we look at stuff that we've all kind of seen before, but finds new favorites in it. And I think we've come to agree that surprisingly, the 1950s Ron Howard has been like the weird point of bright light in this run. I mean, it's been a fun run, but that was just surprisingly enjoyable.
I think if people are looking to talk to you about Sherlock Holmes, Mortal Kombat Conquest, or if we're going to redo previous seasons, like the first season of our series of Genre List, to make it more professional, like it is now, even though I just stuttered multiple times to tell people about it, where could they do those things? Where could they
Professional.
ask you what we should do next?
Since, since we are in a bit of a break from Sherlock Holmes, I will take this point to say if you like more of my Sherlock Holmes rambling, I do recommend the book I have written, which is called Watson is Not an Idiot. It is available on Amazon. It's available in Waterstones. So you can get it most locations and print on demand at this point in time. And that is my tour of the original canon stories. I go through each of the stories and talk a little bit about kind of the context of the story, some things you may not have realized about it, some modern day interpretations of those things. It's about 10 years old actually at this point in time. I need to get around to doing a new edition of it. Um,
Mhm.
but that is one where if you buy that, I do get a percentage of the money. So that is money coming to me if you want to support me in that way. Otherwise, you can find the rest of my work at Pug Steady, Pug like the dog, Steady like the not wobbly, Pugsteady. Or you can find me on the Darker Hue Discords, where right now we are talking about Fallout London, because apparently the Seventh Doctor is in Fallout London, and that's bizarre and amazing, and I don't know why, but I'm going to play it now.
Don't forget that the Sixth Doctor is also supposed to be in there. So you have Colin Baker, who,
Yes.
in anything but the television series of his sixth run, is amazing.
Colin Baker and Spencer McCoy are like have become BFFs in Doctor Who fandom because like they just love to bicker and have fun with each other. So seeing them work together on another project always fills me with delight.
If you're looking to follow me, you can follow me on social media as a Darker Hue. You can come in the Discord and chat with me, where I am trying to get people to talk about, I don't know if I'm going to say it, the actual election and political discourse. Could have a specific channel in the Discord to have political talks. Everything else is just sheer geeky fun. And people keep
Indeed.
posting memes in that channel. That makes me sad because it's not the meme posting channel, and I'm crying on the inside. If you want to support me, you can jump on the Patreon and get some cool stuff, or you can just go to the website and buy Haunted West. I've still got copies sitting around in my attic that I want to sell.
Indeed. So buy those books, talk to Chris about politics, make him happy, and we will see you all next week where we will make you less happy by watching Mortal Kombat Conquest.